Larry Magid, and this is Doing Tech Right, a podcast from Connect Safely, where we and our guests speak about parenting, tech, and related topics, along with strategies and policies to make tech safer and more civil. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe and visit us at ConnectSafely.org. Hey there, it's Larry from Connect Safely, and I'm with Trisha Prabhu, who many of you may know for several years, worked with us very closely as I think our title was Youth Advisor, I'm not sure, but she was doing a wonderful TikTok video every week and a blog post, and we used to use her on our CBS News segment, but she's still part of the family, and Trisha has had an amazing background. I'm sure I can't do your entire bio, and Trisha, welcome to chime in. But what I remember about you is I met you, and I think you were like 13 years old, a gazillion years ago, and you had just created this app called Rethink. And it was this amazing app that essentially looked over your shoulder as you typed on a smartphone and reminded you that maybe you were saying something you might regret later and asking you to rethink it. And I think that's the app still out there, right? You're still doing that.
Yeah, I'm still doing that. And yes, that's a perfect description. Yeah, the idea was to develop a technology that, would encourage young people to pause and rethink potentially harmful words online. And I was 13 when I started that work. I was growing up in the suburbs of Chicago. I was a seventh grader, and I happened to be reading stories online about young people who were being cyberbullied, sometimes viciously. Sometimes for a year and a half. And I was just so horrified by that status quo. And as a 13-year-old, could not comprehend that that was a digital status quo that we had kind of come to accept. I wanted to change it. I wanted the internet to be a place where kindness and inclusivity were, the default, as opposed to toxicity or hate. And so I set out on, what has ended up being this incredible journey that I'm very privileged to have been on, of helping young people to be the best versions of themselves online.
And I know you got incredible recognition. I think you got invited to the White House. You were on Shark Tank. And of course, when you're young, people, you were kind of a child prodigy, and you're still young relative to me, but you're now in law school and you've got yourself, a master's from Oxford a couple of years ago, and, moving along. And,
yes.
And I'm excited because you asked me to be on the board of a nonprofit that is an outgrowth of Rethink. So talk to us about Rethink Citizens.
Yes. So I today am leading Rethink Citizens, which is a nonprofit, and we're so happy to have you on our board, Larry, truly. But our aim is to educate and empower today's young people to create the digital world that they deserve. So, through my work with Rethink, I have the amazing opportunity to talk with young people across the country, around the world, and really two things came out to me. One, young people today are so thoughtful about the digital world and what they want it to be. They have amazing ideas. They're really uniquely positioned to do a lot of this work, this digital change-making work, because they're digital natives, because unfortunately some of them have experienced harm, and because this generation, I think, is so unique and bold in thinking about solution building and thinking about the future that they want for themselves. And so that was really exciting to me. And then, of course, my work with Rethink, another thing I noticed was how excited people were about the possibility of solutions that were working upstream to address digital harm. And, Rethink was one example of that. But this idea of preventative initiatives that were not just about, how do we address harm after it happens, but actually thinking at a systems level about how do we actually create the conditions to ensure that there isn't harm in the first place. That was something that really spoke to people and really resonated with what they wanted. And so kind of with those two things in mind, I came up with this idea for a nonprofit that would directly put young people in the position to invent and innovate, to be leaders in the responsible tech space, creating the internet that they wanted, and in so doing, creating change upstream. Creating cultural change upstream, helping promote digital literacy upstream, investing in new solutions upstream, so that our ecosystem for the internet was fundamentally different in a way that would push the digital world towards more of the pro-social outcomes that we wanted. So we have a number of initiatives at Rethink Citizens. One is our incubator for young people who have ideas to make the internet better. We help them turn that idea into a reality. We have an initiative where we train young people across the country to deliver social media safety workshops to parents and help spark some intergenerational conversations about online safety. And then we also do educational work where we provide young people the skills to be digitally literate and not just digitally savvy, so that they can be critical consumers and users, and so that they can educate young people around them and be a part of a new generation that is thinking really thoughtfully and intentionally about how they engage online.
When you talk about young people, that could be anywhere from 0 to 30 or something. I don't know where we end the term young, but what age group are you really focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, in our work, we're really focused on K through 12. And that K piece, I think, has actually become much more relevant in over the course of my career doing this work. When I first started, I think there was actually a pretty heavy emphasis on high school and then to some extent middle school. Today, because you have so many young people who are including, preteens, kindergartners who are using iPads, who have school devices, who are, on YouTube, Roblox, they're using products relatively younger. A lot of these questions about digital literacy, about ensuring that they're being thoughtful and responsible when they're using devices have become that much more pertinent. So that K piece has become more relevant. And then the hope is that by high school, we are really setting young people up to be the best versions of themselves, to be good stewards of the internet, so that when they go off to college, they're in a good place to contribute to an internet that is healthier. So that's the age group that we focus on. But no doubt, a lot of Gen Z is now out of that age group, has phased out and is kind of in their 20s, and they're also still thinking about what they can do to make a positive contribution.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the special issues surrounding young adults, both men and women. I think women have a somewhat different risk profile than men, although there's some overlap as well. But let's go back for a moment about the younger children, because you raise a really good point, and you talk about preparing people for what lies ahead. I always talk about we're not raising children, we're raising adults, right? You're a child technically from 0 to 18. You're an adult from 18 to who knows. You're an adult for a very long time, many decades. You're a child for 2 decades at the most. So let's talk about starting at a young age, starting with these toddlers that are playing with tablets. I guess what parents need to do, not simply to protect their child from the potential harms that are out there, but to help inoculate their child to the potential harms that they may be facing as they age. In other words, we can ban it, we can prevent it, and that's my daughter, for example. She has a 2.5-year-old, and to this day, she doesn't allow my granddaughter to play with technology. And I respect that, but other parents have a different strategy. And I wonder if you could talk about the different strategies and how that may or may not contribute to a risk factor.
Digital parenting today is really hard when you're trying to figure out where you want to land. And like you said, I think there are diversity of approaches. I think there are a couple of things for parents to keep in mind. I think one, it's important, even as a parent of a child who, let's say, you're waiting, as a lot of parents are now, until like at least 13 to give your child a personal device that has all the functionalities and the apps and the things that they may want to use to socialize. Let's say you're waiting until 13. I still think you should start having conversations with them about the internet, about online safety, about some of these things that can sometimes feel a little squeamish earlier on, when they're 8, 9, 10. And the reason why is, many reasons. One, it kind of shows them from an early age that you are a resource that they can go to, have conversations with about the internet. So many young people today will tell me, well, I don't really go to my parents because I don't necessarily think that they know that much about the internet. Why would I go talk to them about that? What kind of proficiency do they have? Relative to me, they're always asking me for help with their phone. And so I think if you start to initiate those conversations early, you kind of develop a sort of credibility with the young people in your lives, so they know to come to you and they see you as a trusted resource. Two, it allows you to kind of share values early in a way that doesn't feel super contrived, and actually build those values up, over time. So they're kind of inherent in your child when they then get to an age where they're using the device. And three, it kind of allows you, to skill build with them, right? So like if you're, for instance, allowing some access at a younger age, maybe because you want them to do some skill building together, If there's some co-use, so you and the child are kind of, playing a game together, for instance, you can skill build with them, right? And show them what, responsible practices look like when you're playing a video game, or what, it looks like to responsibly scroll and have boundaries, with respect to how much time you're spending on a social media app. So it allows you to kind of skill build with them and teach them what those skills look like.
Mhm.
So I think that is like one core thing, is to have those conversations early. I think too, we have to certainly balance a lot of the risks and the danger with wanting to ensure that young people are literate. They are going to be born into it. I mean, especially generations to come are going to be born into even more of a tech-dominated world with the advent of AI. And so it's important that young people are really literate and can be critical consumers of tech, that they're not getting on, at a much later age without any, context or information. So I think that's something to consider. But, there are certainly, a lot of, interesting research coming out about, young people, devices, especially at those very young ages, it not necessarily being the healthiest thing. And so I think balancing all of those factors is something that every parent will have to grapple with.
It's really interesting to talk about. There's been a lot of research coming out and a lot of policy changes. I mean,
Mhm.
I know you're aware of Australia banning
Yes.
teenagers under 16 from social media, and there are proposals to do that in the United States as well. I was talking just yesterday to a legislator who she wanted to ban them to 18. And she said, well, maybe I'll be maybe 16, but literally just saying that social media, almost by definition, according to some, is harmful. Yet I know you've used social media quite a bit, as have I, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on these proposed bans, and what is there between a ban and just sort of not even thinking about it and letting kids do whatever they want, and potential harms.
Yeah. I mean, I think I understand where people who support a ban are coming from, in the sense that there are a lot of harms associated with the internet and social media. And also, I think a lot of folks pushing for a ban are rightly frustrated that it's been 30 years since the advent of the modern internet. And we haven't really seen much in terms of regulation, in terms of policymaking, to create like some safe baselines, especially for our youngest users in the digital world. So I understand where that feeling is coming from. But I personally don't support social media bans for a couple of reasons. One, talking to young people, I can tell you a lot of young people are not enthused by the idea of a social media ban. Now, Pew Research did find that most young people want to see more regulation of social media,
Yeah.
which is kind of interesting. But like you said, there's a gap, right, between let's ban social media and let's invest in common sense regulations that ensure that there are guardrails in place, that there is a certain kind of safety by design approach to how social media appears in our society. There's a huge gap between kind of social media ban and those types of regulatory changes. I think that's kind of reason number one. Reason number two, and this is, I think, the thing that's most compelling to me, is I don't really understand, if you ban social media, let's say it's like 16, in Australia, you might have a sense as a citizen, as a policymaker, that you've fixed the problem. But in some ways, all you've done is basically say, up until 16, you kind of, will not be a part of this space that is, arguably, for a lot of young people, toxic or harmful. But then as soon as you turn 16, you get access to this thing that isn't actually much safer, or isn't actually, designed in a way to promote pro-social
Right.
outcomes and ensure that, society is leveraging these spaces in a productive way, right? So to me, it doesn't actually get at the heart of the problem, right? If yes, there's a significant difference between, an 8-year-old and a 16-year-old using social media just because of brain development and that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that a 16-year-old can't be harmed by
Right. Well,
cyberbullying or can't be harmed by algorithms. So I think that's my other concern, is I worry that it kind of sweeps the harder changes under the rug by
yeah.
kind of doing this cutoff line that can feel just like it isn't really getting at the root of the problem.
No, you're absolutely right. And as we're going to talk later, even as you enter adulthood, the harms and the risks don't go away. In fact, they never go away, no matter how old you
Yep.
are. And
Yep.
and we're going to get to that in a minute. But I want to talk a little about AI. I mean, AI is something that I think even when you started your career as an internet safety advocate, it wasn't around. I mean, it was around in the labs in a scientific way, but it wasn't a consumer product. And certainly for me, it came very late in my career. I just started using ChatGPT, 2 years ago, I think, is when the world discovered these tools. and they've grown tremendously. I'd love to get your thoughts both on the benefits and the potential harms and the ethical issues. I know you're in law school, you're at Yale Law School right now. I'm sure it comes up in the academic world that you're in. Um, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it is quite incredible how the field has evolved since I first started when I was 13. There were no generative AI chatbots that we were talking with, and of course today, you have very young kids who are creating, AI characters and becoming friends with AI companions, and so the landscape has completely shifted. In terms of like things that I think about, I mean, on the one hand, I am concerned about this idea that AI, it feels like with platforms, one of our biggest concerns with respect to youth, that is social media platforms, was that it was kind of capturing our attention, and kind of putting a little bit of a monopoly on our attention. I worry about with AI it putting a little bit of a monopoly on our connection. This idea that especially for a generation that is arguably one of the loneliest generations that we've had recently. Not dating as much, not spending as much time with other people. In a world in which we have
Having
a lot of
pandemic, I mean, many of people spent
ex-
5 years in practically in isolation, or certainly
ex-
2 or 3 years at least.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly, and I think that of course that affected young people who weren't at school with peers and who instead spent time at home, learning virtually. All to say, in a world in which we already feel like this generation is pretty isolated, I am worried about AI as kind of something that young people are going to turn to for connection or what they think is connection, and
Or
then
even
how does that?
romance. Yeah,
Sorry.
even romance.
Even romance, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think I saw recently that someone actually married an AI companion. So we're starting to
Wow.
get to that place, and it is kind of interesting. You think about how does that degrade our humanity? How does that change, right? Like notions of humanity and why conversations and getting to know people, is so important. So I think there's that concern. There's also, I mean, a host of like new harms, AI deepfakes, of course, a lot of which have disproportionately targeted women, sexualized, explicit content. So that's a key harm. More generally, I'm concerned about this idea that we already live in a society where it feels like it's so difficult to identify what is true and what is not. And now, where you have AI generating a lot of news, it's going to become that much more difficult for people to distinguish, what they should be relying on and what they shouldn't be relying on. And it does feel like democracy is kind of in peril at this moment, not just in the U.S. but globally, right? So to the extent that this is something that's going to complicate, citizens' ability to get information that they need, that's a key ethical issue. But from a legal perspective, I think the thing I'm most interested in is how this is going to change the liability question for a lot of platforms, because for the longest time, a lot of the content that platforms were getting flack for, wasn't necessarily content that the platforms were putting out, right? It was content that some third party was posting on the platform. And so it wasn't necessarily that, some company was saying, oh, here's some, content that's bad. It was someone else who was posting it. And then, Meta was distributing it, possibly amplifying it through an algorithm. Now you have, a company that is generating content, right? There's no third party and then presenting it to you. And so the line in terms of drawing a clear link, from a liability perspective is so much more clear. And so I think we're going to see more lawsuits that are going to raise questions about how you might hold technology companies accountable for some of these harms in a way that just hasn't been possible
Yeah, and we're
for
already
the last
seeing
30
those.
years.
They're already
Yep.
seeing those. I know you're referencing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which immunized companies from civil litigation for what their users posted. And that made an enormous amount of sense in the 90s, in 1996, when that law was composed, because all that CompuServe and Prodigy and AOL were forums, basically. They weren't
Yep.
publishers. So they weren't like the New York Times, where editors and journalists write and are responsible for the what they're writing. They were simply forums. But now with algorithms alone, not to mention AI, but mere algorithms. So the analogy I like to use is, in the old days, CompuServe, and these are names that some of you may not even know, but these services that were out there, they really were kind of like town squares, and they just allowed anybody to say what they want. Now it's sort of like a town square, but the mayor of the town is amplifying. Say, hey, go look at so and so. He's saying this. Here's a mic. I'm going to hand him the megaphone. I'm going to give him the stage. Go listen to him. And that to me is where liability becomes more of an issue, when the platforms are actually using algorithms to amplify. Are they in fact now publishers as opposed to simply just facilitators of a conversation?
Exactly. I think you explained that really, really well, and that's spot on. I mean, I actually wrote a thesis about this at Oxford. So Section 230 is something I'm fascinated by, and I think we are now seeing legislation to sunset it in Congress. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But I think the fundamental, however we feel about Section 230, immunities, and whether for a number of reasons we may not want to completely close off the immunity, or we want to think about in what circumstances we want to give platforms immunity or not. I do think at base this premise that underlines Section 230, which is that internet platforms are just neutral distributors, as you point out, is just not the truth.
Right.
It's just no longer true today, because they are deciding what content to show us. We open a feed and they're deciding, right, based off of what the algorithm is assessing is going to keep us on the longest, is going to have us be the most engaged, and in so doing is going to generate the most ad revenue for the platform. They are deciding to present specific content to us. And so if that content is defamatory, if it is harmful, if it is promoting terrible things that we don't want our platforms to promote, I think we do have to start asking questions about, okay, well, where does the line between this person said this bad thing and then you've decided to amplify it? Where do we draw that line from a perspective of responsibility? So yeah, it is very interesting, and I'll definitely be following those changes in Congress.
So we're starting to run tight on time. I want to kind of talk a little bit about a different age group. So when Connect Safely opened our doors, similar to when you started your work, we were focused mostly on high school and middle school.
Yeah.
And then at some point we created a document called, I think, Toddlers with Tech. And, we realized, as you pointed out earlier, that this issue starts at a young age. And then at some point we created a senior's guide to social media and different seniors resources. But the one age group that we have, I'm being somewhat self-critical now, that we have not addressed are people around your age, maybe a little younger, maybe a little older, people from, let's say, 18 to, I don't know, 30, 34, I don't know where you want to call them, young adults.
Yeah.
And it's not as if, as you pointed out, it's not as if the danger goes away when you're 16. It doesn't go away when you're 18. It doesn't go away when you're 21. And especially when it comes to young women who are often victimized by various forms of sexual harassment.
Yes.
One of our staff people at Connect Safely, our media director, Vu Lee, worked on this Gamergate area where these young women gamers were horribly, horribly harassed.
Yes.
Threatened, sexual harassment, doxed, all sorts of really negative things. But just in general, and then of course the notification apps, it goes on and on and on. Talk to me a little bit about your own age group. Again, a little younger, a little older, but the group that you find yourself in at the moment.
Yeah, it's such a good point, because I think you're totally right. When you look at the advocacy space, around online safety, big emphasis on the middle and high school, age groups, increasingly big emphasis on younger people, and even as you point out, an emphasis on older folks, from a literacy perspective, often, ensuring that, they're not falling victim to scams, that sort of thing. But my age group, and also interestingly, even like we could call them older adults, who are in midlife, we don't really talk about either age group, when I think there is actually quite a bit we could talk about for both age groups. I mean, starting with the older adult category, before I get to the younger adult category, I've heard from young people who will, complain about sharenting, right? And this idea that a lot of parents are, taking pictures of their kids and posting them on social media. Of course, in a world where AI is scraping a lot of that content, or at least, a lot of models are scraping a lot of that content and then training on that content, there's actually a lot of really interesting, I think, new questions about whether you should be posting that kind of content, especially when your children are possibly too young to say.
In defense of older
yes,
people.
In defense of the sharenting.
We're proud of our children. We're proud of our grandchildren. We want to share everything they do, right?
Exactly. But it is interesting, that I hear from young people, and, I'll ask them, like, why is it that you don't necessarily want to listen to mom's screen time rule? And they're like, well, because mom is on Facebook at dinner. Why am I going to follow the rules? She's not following the rules. She, posts all this content. But also say, it's just, that's kind of interesting. For my age group, I think you've already picked up on one key thing, which is, I think, this idea that women are, especially at this age, once you pass that 18 line, really sexualized and harassed sexually. in digital spaces in a way that is just unacceptable. I remember when Millie Bobby Brown, the actress, turned 18, she spoke publicly about how the comments on her Instagram, just her being a legal adult at that point, the comments on her Instagram became so sexualized and so harassing and scary. It was a horrible experience for her, right? So I think in this season of life for young adults, a lot of women find themselves in a place where they feel very vulnerable in digital spaces because they are a little bit younger, but they're of this adult age. And so this idea that young people, especially young women, don't feel safe, I think is an important thing. I also think for this age group, there's this sense that social media becomes even more of a means for connection and almost like replacing friends, because once you're in this age category, you're not necessarily seeing friends every day at school, right? It's not like high school anymore. Once you graduate college, you might be moving to a new city. You don't have friends around you, and so you kind of rely more and more and more on social media to stay connected. And so I think it raises competing concerns. I think on the one hand, you have this concern that maybe this age group is not spending enough time with people in person and cultivating those connections that we think are important for their health, for their well-being, and for society. On the other hand, social media actually might be increasingly more of a place where they are getting that social connection, and it is something that is really valuable to them. I certainly, one of my favorite uses of social media today is to be able to stay in touch with friends I haven't seen in 6, 7, 8 years, right? I get to read about their engagements or see them getting married or having children. And so it's really exciting to be able to track those milestone moments in life. So I think that is definitely another core thing. And then I guess the last thing I'll say is I think for this age group, there's also a pretty big activism piece, because I think a lot of folks 18 above, certainly it's definitely true of high school students as well, but 18 is above, can get pretty involved in activism. And then the digital world becomes a space for them to organize, becomes a space for them to rally people to their cause. And so I've seen a lot of efforts in that domain. So I think, the interesting thing about the young adult category is it highlights both the harms and some of the real benefits of social media for young people. Though it is interesting, I mean, I still know people in their early 20s who say they have to delete TikTok or delete Instagram before they sit down to study, because they just know that if it's on their phone, they're going to be tempted and they can't focus. So, but all to say, I think in this age group, you see a little bit more of that balancing between some of the real benefits and the real harms.
Changing gears back to cyberbullying of teens, you can have two kids who have had essentially the same experience. One handles it pretty well, and the other gets very, very depressed and really has trouble with it. And so there's clearly things that are going on in terms of resilience, in terms of how you respond, in terms of how your family and your friends and your school and other people respond. And so let's talk about what separates the people who have really negative consequences. And some of this, of course, has to do with your mental state that maybe are beyond your control, but sometimes it's things that we can control in terms of both prevention and how you cope with something that may have happened to you. Let's talk about some of those strategies, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, like you said, I think that there are factors that are sometimes out of control. For instance, if you're coming from a family where there are already other challenges at home, and so this is something that's exacerbating existing challenges, all of which is contributing to mental stress, right? I think those factors are very real. But setting kind of the factors that are out of our control aside, acknowledging that they can play a really important role, I do think that this idea of like building resilience is really important in young people. I think a big part of that comes from, again, parents having conversations with young people early, telling them things, for instance, like if there's an image that goes up online and it's really embarrassing, that's okay. It's not the end.
Right.
It's not the end all be all for you, because for a lot of young people, especially because so much of their identity today really is bought into the digital world, that can feel like the end all be all, right? And so having conversations about the idea that like you are not your digital self and that you have worth independent of how people see you online, I think is really, really important. I think too, like having conversations about how to take action if there are harms that occur is really important. A lot of young people don't think necessarily to report, whether to the platform or to an adult or a parent that can help them. And that makes it more difficult, again, to respond in a way that's resilient. And then I think, it's very important for young people today, independent of all of that. I actually don't think it's it's a tech related thing. I think it's important for young people today to have a strong sense of self. And I think the way that you bolster that is, of course, there are so many ways that we can do that for young people. To the extent that we can remind young people that they are loved, that they are whole people, and that they should love themselves as they are. We set themselves up to be resilient in the face of in-person harassment, in the face of online harassment, to see themselves as something that is more important than the worst thing that someone has to say about them.
Yeah, and the other thing that's important is, and I think there's a Trevor project had this term, it gets better. And as trite as that may sound, it's important to remember that. I remember when my daughter was, I think, in middle school or early high school, she would sometimes come home very upset and depressed. Somebody had been mean to her, or she didn't get something she wanted. And what I said to her, I said, whatever's happening now, I bet you a year from now, you'll barely remember it. It won't be happening. Something else will happen, but this is going to go away. I mean, life is full of challenges. There are always challenges to life, but somehow we managed to muddle. Most of us managed to muddle through them. And again, you mentioned the notion of if an image gets out to you. I mean, sextortion is a real issue. I actually counseled a young man, a college freshman, who fell for one of these sextortion schemes. Was really worried that his image would get out there. And I assured him that people are not going to judge you, that you're going to be fine. Even if the worst happens and your naked image winds up on the internet, it's not going to ruin your life. It's not good, but it's not going to ruin your life.
100%. I think that's so right. I think so many young people think, oh my gosh, if that image goes public, oh my gosh, if people see all these comments harassing me, if people see that video that's so embarrassing of me, it's the end all be all, my life is ruined. It's not. I mean, no one is ever going to judge you. And that's the thing I like to, and I remember talking about this in an Ask Trish post, actually. No one is going to judge you as the victim because you've done nothing wrong, right? And so I think that's so important. It's not the end all be all. It's not going to ruin your life. And you are so much more, again, than one of the worst things that someone could do to you. But I love your point too about it gets better, because I think middle school is for many generations now been a very hard time generally. And then I think when you add the technology piece in, it gets a little bit harder, certainly at a minimum for young people. And so I think reminding them, right, that at 13, I thought, oh gosh, this is going to be how it is forever. And at 25 now, I have a very, very different perspective. And so I think sharing with them, right, that again, these instances of, a lot of young people often not being thoughtful, maybe feeling hurt themselves and projecting that hurt onto other people. That is not the end all be all of life. There's so much more to come, so much that young people have to offer. And so knowing who they are, why they, are important and feeling worthy, that is what is key as they move forward.
Yeah. And, I once heard this speaker at a conference make the point, there was a time when if you had a tattoo, you couldn't get into some colleges or you could never get a job. And of course, tattoos are extremely common now. And the point is not, it has nothing to do with tattoos, but the fact that social norms change and what we look at in one moment as being horrible, forbidden or something, years later is not such a big deal. I mean, even something like nudity, which is still, at some point, it just may not be a big deal.
Totally. I think totally. And I think our generation in particular is really liberal, with respect to norms like that, which I think is a good thing. I think we really embody this idea of live and let live. Right. Yeah. And so I think to the extent that young people are growing up today and worried, increasingly about how other people may judge the way that they live, remembering that we increasingly have the privilege of living in a society where live and let live, at least I hope, continues to be, the way that we approach. And if not only let live, but celebrating how other people live and affirming them in that. So, I think all reasons to be optimistic about young people living in an increasingly digital future.
So Trisha, thank you so much for joining us. Trisha Prabhu from Rethink and Rethink Citizens and part of the ConnectSafely family. It's such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Larry. I was so honored to be on, and this was a really wonderful conversation. Thank you for having me.
Doing Tech Right is produced by Christopher Lee. Maureen Kochan is executive producer. Theme music by Will Magid. I'm Larry Magid.